Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 15th episode of The Greats of History, the podcast where we get to know people with the epithet of the Great and try to get past the honorific and understand who they were, what they did, and why some people seem to like them oh so much. I am grateful, truly grateful, that you are here. Last time, we followed Alex as he began his invasion of Persian territory, his head-to-head battles with the great Greek mercenary General Memnon, and his initial tussle with Darius at the Battle of Issus. Alexander bested his Persian rival, captured his family, and then beat him again at Granicus. While Darius fled east to take another stab at rebuilding his shattered forces, Alexander marched to the coast and successfully completed the spectacular siege of the island fortress of Tyre. After Tyre, Alexander worked his way down the coast and aimed straight for Egypt. Along the way, he occasionally stopped to lay siege to a city here or accept supplication of a city there. The Egyptians, you may recall, fell to Cambyses, son of Cyrus the Great, in the 500s BCE. The Egyptians never took to Persian rule, often rebelling and occasionally succeeding. They even briefly restored Egypt to Egyptian rule for a few decades. This didn't last terribly long, and the Persians reasserted control. By the time Alexander showed up, the Persians had crushed the most recent Egyptian uprising just a generation earlier, but the resentment of the Egyptians at their subjugation festered. The Persians had entrusted control of their Egyptian satrapy to a noble named Mazaches. When Alexander arrived on the outskirts of Egyptian territory in 332 BCE, Mazaches stood and watched as thousands of Egyptians poured out in joyous celebration, welcoming Alexander as a liberator. With so many of the empire's resources drained from organizing resistance to Alexander, Mazaches faced a predicament. He had been entrusted to defend and administer Egypt for Darius, but he was short on soldiers, and staring down the might of Alexander's deadly, battle-tested, and plunder-hungry army. Besides, it was pretty clear that the locals didn't want him around. Mazaches prudently surrendered Egypt to Alexander without a fight. Just to make sure Alex understood what a swell and submissive guy he was, Mazaches tossed in 800 talents, about 56,000 pounds, of gold into Alexander's coffers. Alexander accepted the surrender and either let Mazaches retire with quiet dignity or rewarded him by appointing him to an administrative position. Either way, Egypt fell to Alexander without a single casualty on either side. Once in the country, Alexander made a point of showing off his Hellenic culture. He sent for athletes and artisans and had them perform their wonders for the locals. He offered sacrifices to the Greek gods and made a grand show of religious and cultural piety, demonstrating to the Egyptian the cultural superiority of their new overlords. But he did pick one Egyptian god to exalt, the bull god Apis. The Egyptians revered Apis and selected the finest bull to worship as the god's earthly manifestation. The Apis bull was treated with great awe and reverence. It was doted on, groomed, and fed the finest food. It led a better life than any of us do. When it died, the Apis bull was mummified and interred with great solemnity. Then the search would begin anew for the next sacred calf to be raised as the next Apis bull god, and the worship would begin anew. Alexander's patronage of Apis was a clever diplomatic ploy. Rumors had swirled that a drunken Cambyses had committed an unspeakable sacrilege when he had personally slain the Apis bull. While it was highly unlikely that Cambyses had done so, the rumor had swirled and taken hold in the popular imagination. By the time Alexander came around, many were sure that this had happened. Alexander's deference to and sacrifice for the benefit of Apis was a calculated act to distance himself from the Egyptians and their hated Persian oppressors. The adoring people proclaimed him Pharaoh, a title he accepted without reservation. Back in the Darius I episode, I said that I believe that part of the poor reputation of Cambyses is due in large part thanks to Alexander. Once in Egypt, he and his retainers had an incentive to believe and then embellish all the worst things that people had said about Cambyses and the Persians. Alexander understood that his conquest of Egypt would be much easier to pull off if the Egyptians felt that the Macedonian occupation was an upgrade. The Greek historians understood the worse they made Cambyses look, the more it justified Alex's seizure of Egypt and its incorporation into his empire. But it was one thing for mere mortals to accept Alexander's overlordship. What about the gods? Alexander was keen to find out if the Egyptian gods were as bullish on his conquest as the Greek ones seemed to be. After returning north, he selected a core group of retainers to join him on an arduous journey to the west. Their destination was the sanctuary oasis of Siwa, home to the oracle of Amun, the chief god of the Egyptian pantheon. The group marched through the western desert, traveling through searing heat with almost no water for 4 days. When they finally made it through the desert and into the temple precinct, the chief priest greeted Alexander as son, a statement that told Alexander that they saw him as the son of Amun, a good omen. Through his mother's mythic conception through Zeus, Alexander was already the son of God's chief god. Now he could make the same claim for Egypt, too. Delighted, Alexander inquired of the oracle as to the outcome of his pending conquests. Alexander was informed that he was fated to conquer the entire world. Thrilled with this very clearly self-serving response on the part of the priests, Alexander lavished the sanctuary with gifts and promptly marched back through the desert to the Nile Delta. Before leaving Egypt to resume his conquests, Alexander, perhaps a bit more invested in the Egyptian religion given that he was the son of their chief god, ordered the restoration and embellishment of sacred temples and their precincts and sacrifices made to all sorts of Egyptian gods. Far from the oppressive overlord the Persians had been, or so he claimed, he was respectful of the culture and the religion of his new subjects. But while he was titled pharaoh, he didn't spend too long in the country. He was fated to be more of an absentee landlord than an actual sovereign. Alexander had one more to do before skipping town. He had to put his name on the map. As he did so often throughout his life, he decided to found a new city and name it in honor of the most glorious and illustrious guy he knew, himself. On the Mediterranean coast, where the Great Nile spills into the sea, Alexander picked a spot and founded a new city, Alexandria. In time, Alexandria would go on to be one of the leading centers in the world, a hub of culture and commerce. Alexander gets credit for founding the city, but when he left, the laborers had barely put shovels to earth. In 331 BCE, Alexander left Egypt in the hands of a trusted retainer, loaded up his army, and hit the road. For his part, Darius had been busy. With Alexander on his jaunt down to Egypt, the Persian king of kings had been working diligently, recruiting yet more soldiers and drilling them into shape. He rebuilt the Persian war machine. He was prepared to fight for his kingdom and to win back his captive family. An epic showdown loomed. Attempts to negotiate were over. All that remained was for the two great powers to slug it out for control of the largest empire in the world, once and for all. But before leaving Egypt, I want to address what might seem like a bit of a contradiction in the past few episodes and within this one. On one hand, I have shared that many of the Greeks, especially those from Athens, turned their noses up at the Macedonians, whom they tended to see as semi-barbarous. On the other, I have pointed out several times, and will point out in this episode again, that the histories that come down to us are pro-Alexander because they were all written by Greek historians. For example, the contrast between how the historians treat the Persian occupiers of Egypt and the more benevolent picture they paint of Alexander. How can the Greeks simultaneously patronize the Macedonians and skew the narratives in his favor? For one, the Greeks that were particularly condescending towards the Macedonians, especially Demosthenes, were not necessarily the ones writing these histories. But more significantly, after Alexander's life and career, the posthumous eulogizing and mythologizing changed the way historians approached their subject. This was especially the case because of the spreading of Hellenic culture. It was something that Alexander was and is widely lauded. For those writing the histories, Alexander became an instrument of bringing what they saw as a superior culture to the rest of the world. The Greek historians tended to blur the lines between Greek and Macedonian as it suited their narratives. This is part of why Philip gets portrayed as a violent drunk in many sources, and Alexander a charming, charismatic, and brilliant leader. Philip wasn't the beneficiary of an extended eulogy throughout the histories, but Alexander was. When you really stop and look at the two guys, they were remarkably similar in intellect, strategic vision, disposition, and temperament. Philip was probably a little more rough around the edges on the outside, while Alexander carried more of an air of refinement, but they were truly father and son. Okay, so with that cleared up, let's rejoin the story. After Alexander whipped Darius III at Issus, he went down to Egypt and, among other things, overthrew the local Persian rule and got himself recognized as the chief Egyptian god Amun and founded a new city in the Mediterranean in his name, Alexandria. Okay, that's for a quick, rapid summary. Darius went home to plan, raise, and train an army. He even equipped some of his infantry with the Macedonian sarissa. For 2 years, Darius readied himself and his kingdom for the final confrontation. Before the eventual day arose, Darius got devastating news. His wife, Statira I, had died in childbirth. Upon hearing this, it's possible that you wondered just how much time had elapsed between the Battle of Issus, the last time Darius had seen his wife, and this very sad day. The answer is much longer than the term of a pregnancy. Darius could not have been the father. So who was? All the sources we have about these conflicts are written by the Greeks, and they all positively trip over themselves describing how courteous Alexander was to the women of the royal harem, treating them with great respect, as was appropriate to the wife, mother, and children of a great king. But then, how exactly had Statira gotten pregnant? There was only one person who could be responsible: Alexander. It is unfathomable that anyone in Alexander's circle would have dared to even make direct eye contact with Statira. When the Macedonian troops looted the Persian camp after the Battle of Issus, the same series of events that led to the capture of the Persian harem, not one Macedonian soldier, frenzied with pillage though they may have been, touched Darius's personal treasure. By all rights, that could only belong to the king, and that was just some gold and silver. By possessing her and the other royal women, Alexander possessed a part of the empire as manifest through their bodies. By being with her in a manner that would lead to pregnancy, Alexander was further extending his dominion over Darius. It seems unlikely, verging on impossible, that any other of the Macedonian command structure could have been responsible for her pregnancy. But what can't be known if Statira was a willing participant. A lot of the sources suggested that she and Alexander came to have great affection for one another. Then again, and as I've mentioned, those sources tend to be written by Greek authors, so they had an incentive to shift the portrayal of Alexander toward a positive light, especially on something so delicate as Statira's pregnancy. There is one thing that lends credence to the idea that Statira enjoyed being around Alexander, and that's that Darius's mother, Sisygambis, also a captive, struck up and maintained a lifelong friendship with the Macedonian king, even long after her own son was toppled from his throne. It seems unlikely that the two could be such great friends if he was also committing sexual violence on members of her family. We can't discount the possibility that after a few years on the road with Alexander, treated with great pomp and deference, that they became to enjoy their time with the Macedonian. I mean, he was adjudged by history to have been strikingly handsome, witty, learned, and chivalrous. He also just happened to be fine with wholesale sackings of cities and the plunder, rape, and pillage of them and their people when it suited his agenda. Great to hang out with small groups and awful at a party. Upon Statira's death, Alexander gave her a splendid royal funeral, as befitting the queen of Persia. The fate of their son, the Prince Ochus, is left certain. He seems to have survived his mother's death and lived a few years before vanishing from the historical record. It seems likely that Alexander had an incentive to murder his own son, lest he become the focal point of a Persian insurgency aimed at restoring the Achaemenids. Then again, given his later pattern of seeking to blend the Hellenic and Persian worlds into one superculture, it's possible that the young boy didn't live long before dying a natural death. It's not an uncommon fate, sadly. With the death of his wife rattling around in his head, Darius was more determined than ever to vanquish Alexander. The armies finally met in 331 BCE near a place called Gaugamela, a Greek derivative of the local word meaning camel hump, the geographic feature from which the area took its name. The army that Darius assembled was massive. Once again, the ancient sources vary wildly, with some running to almost comic hyperbole: 250,000, 500,000, a million soldiers. Once again, these numbers are likely wildly inflated. What matters is that the Persians, once again, dramatically outnumbered the Hellenic forces, and especially when it really counted, with the cavalry. The Persians fielded approximately 40,000 mounted troops. The forces under Alexander, foot soldiers and cavalry combined, were somewhere just south of 50,000. The size of the forces, in particular the heavy advantage in cavalry, should have tilted the balance towards Persia. As the battle approached, the omens for Darius were ominous. A lunar eclipse was seen as an evil portent, and panic slowly crept through the ranks. Darius approached the battle with his two most trusted lieutenants, the satraps Bessus and Mazaeus, on either side. He took the center of his massive army. Alexander, as always, led for the companion cavalry. He lined up on the right. Parmenio again led the Macedonians from the left. As the Macedonians advanced to close the gap with the Persians, they did so at a leisurely walking pace. No need to exhaust themselves running across the expanse. When the front lines of the opposing forces finally made contact, the battle started out as an even and hard-fought affair. One of the key weapons in the Persian arsenal were their heavy chariots with razor-sharp scythes jutting out from the wheels. These blades could lop off the limbs of an enemy troop, anyone unlucky enough to be in their path. These heavy chariots were used to strike terror, as well as to cause confusion in the ranks of the enemy and to force them out of position. Then, when the enemy was in disarray, the heavy cavalry would come crashing in and crush the enemy infantry. It was a great plan, and it had proven effective time and again. Unfortunately for Darius, Alexander was ready. As the battle raged, Darius unleashed his scythed chariots. The heavy cavalry followed close behind, ready to take advantage of the chaos that was sure to follow. As they did when facing the Thracian fire carts discussed in part 2 of this series, Alexander's troops simply moved into their prearranged positions, opening up lanes, and the chariots rolled harmlessly through. Then the troops repositioned themselves, stuck out their sarissas, and braced themselves against the hard-charging cavalry. The cream of the elite Persian cavalry impaled themselves on the giant spears, and in a few minutes, Darius' big advantage was wiped out. Sensing that a rout was forthcoming, Darius again fled the field and abandoned his army. When word crept through the Persian ranks that their king had deserted them, their morale plummeted. Once again, Gaugamela turned into a rout. Alexander did not want to let Darius slip through his fingers again. Ordering Parmenio to wrap things up and plunder the Persian camp, Alexander took his cavalry on a frantic sprint to catch Darius. Parmenio did as he was ordered. Some ancient accounts suggest that 300,000 Persians lay dead on the field at the end of the day. Again, this is likely ancient hyperbole, but the carnage was truly horrific. Just a few hundred of Alexander's army were killed. It was a staggering defeat for the Persians, an utter and total rout at the hands of Alexander's army. Alexander followed hot on Darius' heels, almost catching him several times. He didn't catch the king, but he did eventually capture his personal weapons and armor and another 4,000 talents of precious metal. Eventually, Alexander broke off the chase and focused on ensuring the submission of several major cities, the first of which was Babylon. Long subject to the Persians since the conquest of Cyrus the Great, the local Babylonians had no deep affection for their overlords in general, or Darius III specifically. Much as his Egyptian counterpart had done previously, the Persian satrap of Babylon, Mazaeus, yielded to pragmatism and surrendered the city without a fight. Alexander promised to respect all property, and his soldiers restrained himself from the usual sacking and raping and pillaging. To compensate for the lack of spoils of war, Alexander distributed payments to his troops. For his part, Mazaeus was allowed to switch sides and join Alexander's administration, the first Persian to be appointed to a Greco-Macedonian satrapy. Once inside Babylon, Alexander sacrificed to the local gods, especially the chief god Marduk, continuing his emerging pattern of respecting local religions and cultures. You may remember that back in the episode about Nebuchadnezzar, I mentioned the towering ziggurat Etemenanki and its looming fate at the hands of a future great. This ziggurat is what many believe was the inspiration for the biblical Tower of Babel, and Nebuchadnezzar's episodes are worth a listen if you haven't had a chance yet. By this time, the great ziggurat had fallen into disrepair, and Alexander ordered its restoration. But in time, he grew frustrated with the slow pace and decided that it would be better if he just tore it down and rebuilt it from scratch. He ordered Etemenanki's destruction. It was duly razed, but it was never rebuilt. An awe-inspiring marvel of the ancient world was thus lost to history. Alexander may have been well-intentioned, but he was too easily distracted to see this project through. By now, Alexander was enjoying a nice, leisurely romp through Darius' crumbling empire. Next on the to-do list was to seize the administrative capital of the Achaemenid Empire, the strategic and ancient city of Susa. As with Babylon, the Persian satrap surrendered the city and its massive treasury without a fight. Once again, Alexander appointed the satrap to remain in service as the local governor in the burgeoning Macedonian Empire. By now, Alexander was realizing that Darius had some pretty talented administrators in his service, and maybe dating back to taking a bath in Darius' tub following the Battle of Issus, Alexander began taking on the cadence and rhythms of Persian court rituals. Much to the chagrin of some of Alexander's inner circle, the king began blending Persian customs with Macedonian ones. But Alexander's capture of Susa brought more than a capable governor or two. It came with lots and lots of cold, hard cash. The capture of the Susan treasury transformed a staggering amount of wealth from Persia to Alexander. Remember, a talent is roughly equal to 70 pounds. At Susa, Alexander gained 40,000 talents of precious metals, with another 10,000 talents in minted coins, 50,000 talents, 3.5 million pounds. 1,750 tons. This translated to 500,000 years of wages for a Macedonian. Alexander spent piles of cash back to Macedonia and to Greece. His gain was Darius' loss. The Persian king's ability to fund his resistance took a huge hit. With the loss of Susa and its treasury, things went from bad to worse for Darius as he continued to flee east in the vain hope of rebuilding and trying to fight back just one more time. Alexander had unfettered movement in the Persian heartland, and he took full advantage of it. Next up for Alexander was the ceremonial capital of Persepolis. We discussed the building of Persepolis back in the episode about Darius the Great. More a ceremonial center than an administrative capital, Persepolis was nonetheless beautiful, home to a stunning architecture, palaces, gardens, gateways, halls, and grand staircases. You name it. It was a monumental accomplishment, truly a wonder of the world. For 2 centuries, Persepolis had been the symbolic heart of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, and now, without so much as a scuffle, it was in the hands of Alexander. If you thought Susa was a big score for Alexander, wait until I tell you about Persepolis. At Susa, Alex cleared 50,000 talents. At Persepolis, the haul ballooned to 120,000 talents. That's 8.4 million pounds of precious metal. Just adding these 2 treasuries up, it really gives us a sense of the scale of Persian wealth, which was truly staggering and far beyond anything a Greek or Macedonian could claim or even dream of. Back when Darius offered Alexander 10,000 talents to turn around and head home, it kind of makes you wonder if maybe he'd up the ante if things could have been a little bit different. One can only wonder. At the outset of this campaign, Alexander and Philip before him justified the Greco-Macedonian aggression toward Persia as revenge for Persia's invasion of Greece under Darius I and Xerxes I. Xerxes, in particular, was an object of scorn because he had marched to Athens and torched the Acropolis. At Persepolis, Alexander claimed that he had sought and achieved revenge for the dishonor suffered by the Greeks 1.5 centuries earlier. Conveniently, he dropped any mention of the fact that Macedonia had been allied with Persia, not Athens, in that long-ago conflict. Alexander, who liked to claim a refined aesthetic and appreciation for fine art and architecture, was nevertheless unmoved by the astonishing beauty of Persepolis. Making sure that nothing of value was left behind, he and his troops left no stone unturned in pillaging the city. In 330 BCE, and after 4 months of looting everything that wasn't nailed down, Alexander put Persepolis to the torch, burning the great and grand city to the ground. Darius might have been on the run, but the Achaemenid Empire was dead, both practically as well as symbolically. Enriched by his staggering plunder, Alexander resumed the chase after Darius. The great king had not given up. He kept pushing east, and lest we forget, this empire was huge. There were still more territories to try to levy troops from, and the rugged terrain would be a challenge for even Alexander's juggernaut. But some of the people around Darius lost faith in his ability to stem the tide. One, Bessus, the same guy that had been at Darius' side at Gaugamela, felt that Persia needed a new king, one who would stand and fight, not keep running away every time Alexander got close. Bessus betrayed Darius, and he led a coup. Seizing Darius and putting him in chains, Bessus declared himself King Artaxerxes IV, but he, too, kept fleeing ahead of the relentless Macedonian advance. Alexander just kept coming, continuing his chase, determined to seize the king, whoever it happened to be, and completing his stunning conquest of the mighty Achaemenid Persian Empire. As Alexander bore down, Bessus decided that hauling the captive Darius around was just slowing him down. He had the king stabbed and left for dead. While the former king, the ruler of the magnificent Achaemenid Empire, slowly bled to death, Bessus made a break to escape the fast-closing Alexander. The Greek chronicles tell a tall tale that Alexander reached Darius before he died. The Persian, dying though he was, still, somehow, dedicated his last few words to praising Alexander. Recognizing his talent and genius, so the sources say, Darius told Alexander that he, Alexander of Macedon, was the true heir to the empire, the Persian Empire. It was in this last and decidedly convenient conversation that Darius confessed that it was him that had been behind the assassination of Philip all along. The magnanimous Alexander stayed by Darius' side and comforted the king as he died. There are a lot of tall tales told in the Greek version of events, but this ranks among them. Alexander was always looking for justifications for his action. To demonstrate his magnanimity, Alexander ordered that Darius receive a magnificent state funeral at Persepolis, the burial place of his ancestors, even though the great city was now a smoldering ruin. He paid for this gesture with the treasure he had stolen from the now dead king that he was so quick to honor. Around this time, Alexander faced the first significant challenge from within his own ranks. For one reason or another, Dimnus, one of Alexander's soldiers, decided to plot the king's assassination. He is not an important figure, and nothing survives to indicate his motive. But he did let the plot slip, and eventually word leaked out. One person who heard the rumor was Philotas, one of Alexander's most trusted generals and cavalry commanders. Philotas was also the son of Alexander's number 2, the great general Parmenio. Parmenio had served with Macedonia with unyielding loyalty and unsurpassed competence. He was a brilliant field commander, a gifted strategist, and he never missed a beat in the transition from Philip II to Alexander III, even when the latter ordered the execution of his son-in-law Attalus. Philotas does not seem to have been actively involved in any plot to kill Alexander, but he failed to alert the king to the rumor. When Alexander found out about this sin of omission, he ordered Philotas seized, tortured, and executed. Alexander now faced a dilemma. Killing Parmenio's son-in-law might not have shaken the general from his loyalty, but the execution of his full son definitely had the potential to do so. Alexander thus dispatched his own assassin with orders to get to Parmenio before word of Parmenio's son's death could reach him. Word tended to travel fast, but the killer was faster still. In 330 BCE, Alexander's deadly messenger arrived, reaching Parmenio and, following the explicit orders from the king, murdered the great general. Parmenio, a lifelong servant of the Argeads, never knew the fate of his son or the reason for his own. A lifetime of service, gone in a flash of steel. For his part, the upstart Artaxerxes V, I guess, fared no better. Pushing ever eastward, he seems to be the last one willing to see the writing on the wall. Just as he betrayed Darius, a couple of his officers betrayed him, arresting the usurper and handing him over to Alexander, hoping that by doing so they could put an end to this drawn-out affair that all understood was a foregone conclusion. Besides, as with the Persian satraps in places like Babylon and Susa, Alexander had shown that if someone came willingly over to his side, he could cut them a pretty sweet deal. The young Macedonian king could afford to pretend to be deferential to the memory of the fallen Darius. Alexander meted out horrific punishment as revenge for the regicide. It was one thing for Alexander and Darius to engage in battle, in war. It was another thing entirely for a lower-ranked army officer to violate the dignity and majesty of a king through such unspeakable acts. Alexander had Bessus stripped naked and made him stand in chains as the Macedonian army marched by. Then Bessus was publicly flogged. Finally, in echoes of a long-standing practice of disfigurement, Alexander ordered that Bessus's nose and ears be cut off. Alexander finally sent Bessus to the key regional capital of Ecbatana, where he was executed while Darius's brother watched. It's worth briefly revisiting why Bessus's comrades betrayed him in the first place. Part of their incentive came from the way that Alexander was handling the former Persian satraps and administrators. When they were people of talent, or they demonstrated a willingness to submit themselves to Alexander, he had been content to let them continue in their posts or to take different roles in his reorganized empire. Much as the Babylonians and Persians had demonstrated respect for and often adopted local customs and traditions, Alexander adopted many of the Persian ways of doing things, including continuing to rely on the people that had been working the machinery of local administrations. The guys that turned on Bessus understood that they would be better off enjoying autonomy as, say, Bactrian satraps, than living on the run, giving up their lives to the lost cause of Achaemenid Persia. When Darius died, so too did the Persian Empire. It would rise again in due time, and produce a few greats for us to consider down the road, but for now, it was all Macedonia all the time. Except, it wasn't. Alexander was never blindingly ethnocentric, taught by Aristotle to be curious and to understand that other cultures were different, not necessarily inferior. Alexander took to life as a Persian king of kings like a fish to water. He started wearing fancy clothing, adopting the aloof airs of a disinterested Persian king of kings, and generally just being kind of insufferable. This really started to bother some of his inner circle, and this disaffection would have disastrous consequences. With this ominous foreshadowing, we're going to pause the story here. But it's not all gloom and doom for Alexander. Think of all he's accomplished over this episode. He's conquered Egypt, he finally bested Darius III for good, and he toppled the pretender Bessus. With the conquest of Persia, it was more or less complete. No one was left standing to contend with Alexander for ruler of that great and now vanquished kingdom. It's been a productive episode for Alexander, but don't worry, there's plenty left to do. Thank you for listening to this episode. I'm grateful that you did. Join us on the next one when we seek to answer the question, was Alexander a megalomaniac, or was he truly great?